This subject of feeding bees is, it's interesting. There's a lot going on that we don't really understand. There's really quite a debate going on about feeding bees, whether it's good for bees or bad for bees. And, you know, the proponents say it's a necessary element of modern beekeeping to help keep your bees alive. And the people that oppose that opinion will tell you that feeding bees makes them weak and sickly. And the more I learn, the more I realize that they're actually both right. It just depends on circumstances, methods, the type of feed you use, a lot of things actually. There's no cut and dry answer here. There really isn't. I kind of got inspired on this subject last year. I went to a beekeeping convention and listened to a man speak about natural beekeeping, and he flatly stated that you should never, ever feed your bees, that it was bad for them. And you know, some of his logic made sense. He was talking about things such as you don't want to prop up colonies that might otherwise perish, because then you're promoting genetics that, you know, won't survive in your local community. And he also brought up the subject that feeding sugar syrup makes your bees weak and sickly. That's where I got that line from. Something happened. I learned later about this lecture that there was a bunch of brand new beekeepers in the audience, and they were I watched them, they were taking notes, they were paying attention closely. And I heard about one that went home and took his message to heart and didn't feed his bees ever. Guess what happened? He lost all of his bees. So there's, you know, you just got to be mindful about what's going on here. It's better to avoid a catastrophic loss than, you know, than try to promote local genetics that, you know, and so on. You know, this is like the James Bond method of trying to select, you know, live or let die, literally. And if they all die, where are you? I say it's better to keep your bees alive and select from the colonies that are exhibiting the traits that you want. You can do that. You can do it for mites, you can do it for longevity, you can do it for a lot of things. Just breed from the bees that are doing what you want. And mites, for instance, let's say you got 20 colonies in the yard. Go through the yard and do a mite wash of every one. If they've all got 2, 3, 5, 10, and one's got 0, which one do you want to breed from? And you can do that with bees that are frugal too. You can see which ones are being frugal. You don't have to lose all your bees to select genetics for local survivor stock.
What do you mean frugal?
Pardon me?
When you said you can see which bees are being frugal.
You can see which ones are on the verge of starving to death and which ones still have 80 pounds of honey on. I mean, you can just see it. You don't have to let the ones that are, you know, eating themselves out of house and home die to get rid of those genetics. Just select from the ones that are, you know, are exhibiting the traits you want, and eventually you'll get to where you want to be. You can do it without, you know, letting your bees die. That's my point. And I want to quote something. This is a kind of an interesting line, and it's old. It's a quote from How to Keep Bees and Sell Honey by Walter T. Kelly. This book was published in 1955. It's actually the first bee book I ever read and hooked me. I mean, I was hooked big time after I read this book. I knew I wanted to be a commercial beekeeper, even though I'd never stuck my finger in a beehive because of reading this book. But there's a neat quote. He says, "You would not expect to raise a calf without giving it plenty of good feed, nor can you expect a grown cow to get a living out of a bare field. Yet many people expect their bees to make a living under all conditions without any help." You know, we can work with the bees. We have to. Things are different. It's not what it was 80 years ago before mites and, you know, back when the pastures were abundant and everything. We kind of have to do our part right now. We're a part of the equation now, whether we like it or not. I'm going to share a quote for you, which is one of my favorite quotes. It's, "What gets us into trouble is not what we don't know. It's what we know for sure that just ain't so." Mark Twain said that. Isn't that great? And in feeding bees, there's some truth in this. Many of us have these preconceived notions, you know, about what's correct and what's not. And in many cases, it's just not so. It's just not so. I'm going to start real early here by making a statement that's truly going to give some of you pause. The often accepted assertion that honey is the best food for bees and that everything else is inferior is incorrect. Honey is not the best food for bees. Does that give any of you pause? I'll bet it does, but it's true. The best food for bees is fresh nectar. You can buy into that probably. But why? You know, why is fresh nectar so much better for bees than honey? If you examine the chemistry that's occurring when fresh nectar is coming in the door and what bees are doing to convert it into honey, it kind of gives you some insight into why, and oddly enough, it can change some of your ideas on feeding bees, because some of this chemistry occurs when you're feeding also. To start with, experienced seasoned beekeepers will tell you, for you new beekeepers here, that a fresh nectar flow can cure a lot of problems. For instance, in a nectar flow, European foul brood can sometimes diminish or simply disappear. Chalk brood can diminish or simply disappear. And if you're paying close attention, you'll notice that hygienic behavior increases, and of course brood rearing increases. Most experienced beekeepers would agree with that, I'm sure. You know, the overall health of a colony just seems to increase during a nectar flow, and a colony that's been struggling a lot of times will regain its step, so to speak, and once again become vibrant and start to grow. So there's something about a nectar flow that works, and we're going to talk about why right now. First of all, it's important to understand that the words nectar and honey are not synonymous. They don't mean the same thing. Honey and nectar are two completely different things. Some of the reasons that honey is so different than nectar, in large part, is due to the enzymes that are added to the nectar. And by the way, curiously enough, the enzymes in honey are almost entirely added by the bees. And it seems that all of them have a reason or a purpose. For example, one of the enzymes that's considered most important is invertase. Invertase, which is added by the bees again, inverts or converts, whatever word you want to use, sucrose into fructose and glucose or dextrose, whatever sugar term you want to use there. And nectar is primarily sucrose. Now, what's the purpose there? What's good about that? Fructose and glucose are more soluble than sucrose. In other words, if you can convert sucrose into fructose and dextrose, I'll use that term, I prefer that to glucose, the honey has the ability to become thicker, and because those sugars are more soluble, you can get more into a given amount of water, if that makes sense. If you couple this with the dehydration process that the bees perform, the moisture in honey can become low enough to where the honey won't ferment. So, pardon me?
I didn't hear that last part. So it won't ferment.
Ferment, yeah. You could use the word spoil. In the case of honey, they are synonymous. Spoiled honey is fermented honey. That's what's going on there. So really, if you look at this closely, what's going on is that they're converting it to make it a more stable food. That's the purpose of all this chemistry, or a lot of the chemistry going on nectar to honey, is they're trying to make this thing stable. The next enzyme that's of even more interest on this subject of feeding is glucose oxidase. The bees add this, of course. Glucose oxidase produces gluconic acid and hydrogen peroxide. Now, we all kind of know what hydrogen peroxide is good for, right? Highly antibacterial. Gluconic acid lowers the pH of honey to a pretty low pH. It's quite acidic. It takes honey down to an average of about 3.9. This level of acidity is highly antibacterial, antifungal, a lot of things. So if you couple this acidity with hydrogen peroxide, which is thought to have most of the antibacterial properties in honey, if you put those two together, you create an antiseptic condition. This antiseptic condition is what's having this positive effect on all these brood issues. It contributes to the overall well-being of the entire colony. It's one of the methods, it's part of the bee's immune system. Now, here's a curious thing. The activity of glucose oxidase becomes very insignificant once the honey is ripe or properly cured. In fact, so much so that in a laboratory, in order to measure the activity of glucose oxidase in honey, you have to dilute it. You actually have to add water to the honey to measure the activity of that enzyme. But when fresh nectar is coming in the door, it's thin, and the activity of glucose oxidase is pronounced and very significant, and produces this gluconic acid and hydrogen peroxide. I see a lot of blank stares. Okay, I'm going to ask a question. I'm actually very curious about this. This is not the kind of stuff you usually hear at a bee meeting. Is this interesting?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, all right. I'm headed on the right track then. But here's a curious thing. Let's say you put honey, first of all, heat. You got to remember heat. If you heat your honey, you kill the enzyme, so you no longer have this activity of glucose oxidase, okay? But let's say the enzyme is intact and you put honey on your wound. What happens is that the fluids from your body and the salinity of your body interact with the honey. They raise the moisture content, raise the pH, and the activity of glucose oxidase once again goes into action and produces more, once again, gluconic acid and hydrogen peroxide. So think about what that means on a wound. That means the honey is actively producing hydrogen peroxide in the moment.
Sustained antiseptic.
Yeah, he said it perfectly, sustained antiseptic. Okay, we're going to get into types of feeds. When you really dig in, you can find studies that will support just about anything you want to say on feeding bees. There's a lot of studies that say it's bad for bees. There's a lot of studies that say it's good for bees. Curiously enough, and this is odd, when you look at lab studies where they dissect bees or figure out the chemistry of bees in a laboratory, they tend to lean towards feeding is bad for bees. But when you look at field studies, in other words, raw results, not necessarily the chemistry, you tend to see more positive results if you're feeding sucrose syrup. If you're feeding high fructose corn syrup, everybody agrees that it's bad for bees. In other words, every study, whether it's positive, negative, whatever, they all agree that the best alternative food for bees is sucrose syrup. They've got studies on grape syrup, pumpkin syrup. I mean, it's bizarre what's out there, what they've studied, but they all agree on one thing, that sucrose syrup, meaning table sugar to us, is the best alternative for bees. So we're about to get into this question, is feeding bad for bees or good for bees when compared to letting them overwinter with honey? And the answer is complicated. The answer is both yes and no. Again, it depends on circumstances and just what's going on. Surprisingly, many studies show colonies overwintering on sucrose syrup performing just as well as those overwintering on honey, and in many cases even better. But there's reasons for it. It has to do with circumstances. For instance, in Canada, a lot of beekeepers have figured out that they'll get through the winter a lot better by taking the honey away and feeding the bees back sucrose syrup. Well, in a state like that, where they may not be flying for 4 or 5 months, it turns out that there are some undigestible elements or solids in honey that can mess up the digestive tract when they haven't been able to get out and, for lack of a better word, poop. They do much better on sucrose syrup because it doesn't have all these undigestible elements. It's just carbohydrates. So, and there's studies to back this up. There's studies where they've taken caged bees and fed them all honey or all sucrose or all high fructose corn syrup. And in some of these studies, it's actually showing that the bees on sucrose syrup are outlasting the bees fed on honey. There was a study out west where they showed honey, sucrose syrup, and high fructose corn syrup. The bees were fed only that during their lifespan, and they found that sucrose and honey were pretty close to each other. In other words, the difference was insignificant, but the bees fed high fructose corn syrup had a 1/3 shorter lifespan. There was a study recently done in, of all places, Turkey, where they were studying the effects of bees being fed a variety of industrial sugars. The bees that were fed sucrose syrup had a positive effect as compared to bees that were not fed at all, just overwintered on honey, and all other sugars that they tried, and there was a bunch of them, all had a negative effect. They kind of proved that sucrose syrup is really the only alternative feed that you want to use for bees. Oh, here's some. This is interesting information for those of you that like feeding bees to stimulate. I read an article, a study actually, from India, and I can't cite it because I can't find it again. Have you ever done that? Gone on, found something? It was like 7 pages back on Google, and I thought, what's this? You know, some guys from India did this study, and what they studied was the results of feeding different concentrations of sucrose syrup. They had very thick to very thin and everything in between. But what they found is that the concentration of sugar versus water that gave them the very best results in wax production, brood production, and just bulk bodies of bees after 2 months was 1.3 parts water to 1 part sugar. That's an odd combination. It's thinner than 1 to 1. In this study, they were not trying to put on weight. They were just trying to produce comb and bees and brood, and that's what worked the best. The reason we... Now, I've actually been at this club in the past and said, you know, I get questions on feeding, and I've always been a proponent and have advised people when they're getting ready for winter to feed very heavily in September when the goldenrod was coming in, when that pollen flow was occurring. I've always felt, just by casual observation, that that's when I got the best results, building colonies for winter and overwintering, just all around. It just felt right. And it turns out there's some studies that kind of back up what I felt. And this comes from a question. Okay, we talked about all this chemistry, gluconic acid, hydrogen peroxide, all of that. Does the same thing occur when you're feeding sugar syrup? And the answer is yes. But there's a big but in there. It depends on circumstances. Proper production of glucose oxidase, actually all enzymes in bees, has to not only to do with the carbohydrates coming in, but they need a little bit of protein to pull it off, to do a good job. And I didn't think there was protein in honey, but it turns out there is. And it's just a minute amount, but that's all it takes for the bees to be able to produce these enzymes. And so obviously, pure sucrose syrup doesn't have any protein in it. But if you have a pollen flow and a minor nectar flow at the same time, turns out you have all the elements to pull this chemistry off when feeding sucrose syrup. So what's that mean in a nutshell? That means if you're feeding, you want to have protein present, whether it's pollen coming in the door, pollen in the comb, ideally pollen coming in the door, because pollen, like a lot of things, fresh is best. Pollen degrades pretty quickly, just like honey does over time. So we're way back to the beginning of this lecture where the question is it good to feed bees or bad? It depends on the circumstances. It depends. You have to be mindful. You're a part of this equation too. Now, in the middle of the summer when absolutely nothing is coming in, does it mean it's bad to feed bees? Heck no. I mean, you got to feed them to keep them going. A lot of commercial beekeepers will feed sucrose syrup during a dearth just to keep the colonies kind of up, you know, a little bit vibrant, when otherwise they might just kind of shut down. And queen breeders feed routinely if there's not a nectar flow. We do it, and we notice consistently when we're building queen cells, whether it's in starting or finishing, that we have much better results when we feed sucrose syrup while this is going on. But we always have pollen in the combs because we always put pollen against the frame of grafts. And if there's not a lot of pollen, we might choose to put in a pollen supplement. Many of you might already be thinking of this question in your head. Can the protein source be pollen supplement? And the answer is yes, it's just not as good as pollen. The richer the nutrition in the colony, the more apt this chemistry is to occur in a very good fashion.
What did you say you put the pollen next to?
Pardon me?
You said you put the pollen next to it.
Well, completely different subject, but when we create queen cells, we put them into a queenless colony of some sort. There's lots of ways of doing that. And we always put a frame of pollen right next to those cells so the nurse bees that are feeding the queen cells have very good nutrition. And we always feed sucrose syrup if there's not a strong honey flow, and we always notice better results. Now I'm learning that we're creating this antiseptic condition, which is so good for brood.